Okay, so I'll be very brief. What should a scientific theory of consciousness explain? Not a philosophical, but a scientific theory. Subjective experience itself, right? That's really what we need to explain. Its essential properties in the way it feels, not just that it exists, but, space has very peculiar property, extendedness, neighborhood relationship, distance, and it's very different from the way time feels. Perception of time, passage of time, it flows, which is very different from the way, my Bernese mountain dog looks and feels and smells, and it's very different from the intrinsic character of color, of pain. And so we need to explain all of that, not just the existence of consciousness, but their peculiar phenomenological properties. And these explanations have to be in terms of objective physical properties. And then the relationship between these subjective mental and objective physical properties can then be empirically investigated by people such as I, by measuring and by perturbing. We can perturb either the conscious experience and then see what effect that has on the physical, the neuronal substrate, or we can perturb the physical substrate, as happens accidentally during a stroke or during other clinical exigencies, or when you take drugs, or put an electrode in a brain of a patient, of an animal, etc. So that's what a scientific theory of consciousness should accomplish. That we have of the two dominant scientific theories of consciousness, integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace theory. I'm just going to focus on IIT very briefly, which is the work, of course, of Giulio Tononi. So it starts from phenomenology. It identifies the essential property of every experience. You can think of that like an axiomatic approach. It says these are the properties that each and every experience, whether it's as banal as eating a cold slice of pizza, or as exotic as a pure experience, in a near-death experience, or if you take 5-MeO-DMT, all of these properties have to obey these essential properties. Then you translate these essential properties into physical properties that particular physical system must satisfy to account for experience. Again, whether that's neurons, or whether that's single cells, or whether that's transistors, is immaterial to the theory. And then the theory also has to account for these phenomenal properties of space, of time, of color, of pain, in terms of physical properties. All right. So I'm not going to, I assume either you know a little bit about IIT and then I'm just repeating what you know, or you don't know, then this is not going to be really an introduction for you, since it's a very sophisticated theory and we would need to spend a few hours talking about it. But it essentially assumes that each and every experience is subjective. It exists from its own intrinsic perspective for itself. This sort of, goes all the way back to Descartes or St. Augustine. Each experience is structured, so it exists, it structures. It has, composed of different distinctions, left, right, up, down. There are, objects within this field of view, etc. Each experience is very specific. It is a particular way it is. It is a particular type of experience. It's different from a trillion other experiences you could be having. It's unitary, it's holistic. It can't be reduced to parts that are experienced separately. And finally, this is really important, it's definite. So what it means that each experience and the distinction relation within each experience includes only the specific distinction and relation it contains, neither less nor more. So it has boundaries. And this is really important ultimately for the physical substrate. It has discrete boundaries. There are certain things that are in it. For instance, the vague feeling that something is wrong. That may be a vague feeling, but it's a very distinct conscious experience. And that vague feeling excludes an uncountable number of other experiences. So when you combine that, and you combine that with notions of existence, in this case having to do with intrinsic causal power, you come to this following view that an experience is identical to a structure. It's really a thing. It's an object. It's a structure. It's a physical structure in cause-effect space. It's a causal structure. So you have a particular physical substrate in a state, whether it's a brain or whatever, and you can unfold its intrinsic causal power. There are ways of doing it. In fact, there's code here. If you have a particular description of a system, you can in principle do this, and ultimately consciousness is this structure. So it's not a process, it's not a computation, it's not a behavior, it's a structure. And the challenge for us now is to map, as I said, each aspect of every experience on the cause-effect structure and on its underlying physical substrate. That I can here, you can see in this picture on the right hand, the woman is observing the brain, which is the physical substrate, the scientist, and she can manipulate it using various techniques in humans and in animals, and study the effect on the experience. So such a theory of consciousness must explain, predict, and infer. So the primary evidence, of course, we have about consciousness is from ourselves. So therefore, we must look to the associated neuronal correlates of consciousness, because we are undoubtedly conscious. I'm conscious, and you guys are all conscious. So one has to in detail investigate the structural and functional relationship between specific experience and the associated neural correlate of consciousness, the so-called NCC. And there's a large, industry of people who are doing exactly this. And so here, Francis Crick and I defined the correlates as those are the minimal neuronal mechanisms, because right now we're focusing on humans that have large brains, or other animals, or particular mammals, all of which have brains in particular cortexes that are jointly sufficient for any one particular conscious experience. And so for every conscious experience, there will be a correlate, and it's a causal notion. If you induce a correlate, let's say using electrode or optogenetics or drugs, you will induce a perception. And if you inactivate or eliminate the NCC, you will eliminate the perception. And so, people study the footprint. Is it in the front, in the back? There are several big team-funded adversarial collaboration now ongoing in humans and in animals to try to investigate it. Is it primarily in the front of cortex? Is it primarily in the back of the cortex? This is an empirical question that will resolve itself. And so the challenge of any theory, including panpsychism, of which, of course, IIT shares a lot of the intuition that panpsychist has developed since the ancient Greece, and in particular Leibniz and Russellian monism shares these intuition, although it also differs in certain respect, because it assigns particular system and set of systems to be conscious, not their supersets nor their subsets. So what any theory of consciousness has to explain, predict, and infer is accounting for, as I said, once again, the specific aspects of any and all phenomenal experiences. So, for instance, any theory worth its salt has to explain why space feels extended. Right? You can define, this is the night sky, but you can also stand in front of a black canvas, and it feels a particular way. It's extended, as I said, the distance relationship, the neighborhood relationship. How do they come about, and how do they reside in the form of the underlying physical substrate that gives rise to it? And I use form here in the Aristotelian sense, which also informs, by the way, integrated information in IIT. It has nothing to do with Shannon information. It's not about sending information from A to B. It really goes back to this older Aristotelian notion associated, I guess, with hylomorphism, informare, to give rise to a form. Same thing, perception of time feels very different than space. Objects, of course, feel different. And then there are things like colors or other local qualities, or the proverbial tooth pain, that all feel particular way, and one has to understand how that particular feeling and its structures comes about based on the underlying physical substrate. This theory of consciousness, particular panpsychism, must also explain and predict and infer which animals have experiences. Is experience adaptive, right? Because after all, we are a product of natural selection by evolution, and so depending on the answer to this question, whether it is or it isn't adaptive, it's important in the context of trying to explain the evolution of large brain organisms such as us and other mammals, with their supposedly high capacity for having conscious experiences. So here we routinely, these are two mammals, we routinely, abuse consciousness in others, including non-human mammals, based on the similarity of behavior, based on similarity of brain architecture, based on the close evolutionary kinships. What we have is mainly language, a sense of self, and a hypertrophied, developed sense of importance. So this is what I do at my institute. Here we study the properties of brains of mice and humans. And here you look at neurons from mice and from neurons. You remove the space bar. They look very, very similar. The basic hardware is very similar. You can do this at the level of transcriptomics, where you find the same sort of cell types and the same types of numbers of cell types in the human brain. In the mouse brain, the main difference is we have 1,000 times more neurons. But of course, then there are other animals like whales who have even a bigger brain. And so the question is, again, for theory of consciousness, how far does consciousness extend throughout the tree of life? So here I put sort of 4 charismatic species: Bernese mountain dog, corvids, bees, and cephalopods that many people argue, based on their complexity of the behavior and nervous system, have the capacity to experience. But of course, you can cast the net much wider, and you can ask, well, what about other organisms that may not even have brains, such as single-cell organisms or some very primitive organisms that are closer to the last universal common ancestor? Does it feel like anything? In particular, if you're a single-cell paramecium, does it feel like something? So based certainly on the complexity of the vast complexity of all the protein interaction in a single paramecium that contains maybe on the order of a few billion proteins of 1,000 different types, no one is even close to modeling that. One IIT would certainly argue that it feels like something to be such a thing, although it may be very, very, very minimal. It's important that a theory addresses those questions and try to do it in a way that's empirically accessible, which of course right now is not very plausible for paramecium, but is more plausible for larger animals such as mice. Then a further question that a theory of consciousness, whether it's panpsychist or not, has to answer is, so if it's true, as I argue and others argued, that consciousness in humans is associated with activity in the posterior part of the brain, not the back part of cortex, not the front, as for instance, global neural workspace asserts. Why? I mean, if this is the case, let's just postulate that's what the evidence shows. And where's the difference that makes a difference? What is it about the form? What is it about the structure? What is it about the connectivity, let's say, of posterior cortex versus prefrontal cortex that makes all the difference? Superficially, they look alike, but of course, there are lots and lots of differences. We know from the clinic that you can lose your cerebellum, or you can sort of lose it either because you never had it, as in case of this Chinese patient, or because you, unfortunately, to have developed a tumor and the surgeon has to remove significant part of your cerebellum. You may have ataxia and all sorts of other so-called cerebellar syndrome, but none of these patients ever complain about loss of consciousness. Why? It has input maps, output maps, lots of things need to be explained. Cortex during seizures, highly active, lots of synchrony, lots of oscillation going on, but people lose consciousness. Why? During deep sleep, your brain doesn't dissolve into soup. Neurons still fire. I can assure you, I've recorded from brains, human brains during deep sleep. It has a characteristic electrophysiological signature, but if you wake people up from this state, typically they report nothing went through their mind. Why? How do you explain near-death experiences or pure experiences? So, for instance, if you've been in an accident and you had anoxia, or if you take certain drugs, you may have had this experience that people refer to as pure experience. I've had, it's quite exceptional. And so a theory of consciousness has to explain that, and I think can. Your practical problems you have to address, any theory has to address, like in this patient here. This is a patient of Nico Schiff. Since many years, he's in this condition. Occasionally, he'll utter one word, shit, and he says that again and again. That's the only thing he ever says. And then you see these islands of activity. This is metabolism. Does it feel like something to be this patient? Or maybe each of these individuals, are there 3 distinct conscious experiences in this patient? When does consciousness begin? You know, in a preterm baby, in uterus, at what point in time? What about sleepwalking? The very interesting cases of twins that have the brain connected at the level of the thalamus. Does it feel like one or does it feel like two? Are these two girls with two conscious experiences? Certainly many conditions there are, and are there some conditions where they're only one? I've written quite a bit about brain bridging, the idea that we can do essentially a reverse so you all know that if we take the human brain and we cut the corpus callosum, which is 200 million fibers connecting the left and the right brain, all the evidence seems to suggest that there's now two conscious entities. One can speak, the other one can sing and utter in this single skull. Now, can you do the opposite? Can you take two normal adult brains, first maybe in mice, but then in humans, and connect them such that you get a single unitary experience called brain bridging? How far, as I mentioned already, how far does consciousness extend across the tree of life? What about these are being discussed right now, cerebral organoids, where you have now using pluripotent human-inducible stem cells that you can develop in a dish. You get, you know, a few million neurons now. They're beginning to show simple forms of electrical activity, including what could be characterized as a neonatal EEG that has sort of burst silence, burst suppression characteristics. Doesn't feel like something to be a cerebral organoid, and the theory needs to be able to address that. What about group mind? Is there sort of a mind, a level of consciousness above and beyond the level of individual consciousness? IT says no. What about robots? And then, of course, the question of our ages. What about in computers? And so these are the questions that I, as a natural scientist, seek to answer. And this is where I'd like some help from philosophers, right? So rather than it seems to me then rather constantly, I spent this past Christmas reading 6 textbooks on the mind-body problem. And I was somewhat dismayed to discover that there was really no sort of single, agreed upon theory of mind body and what it is. It ranges all the way. Some people discuss hylomorphism, and then of course materialism, physicalism, idealism wasn't really discussed anymore. And then of course now panpsychism, and that's all fine, but we can't constantly relitigate these ancient isms. What we need progress. Otherwise, in 2,000 years from now, we'll still have the same debate. Is it physicalism? Is it, whatever ism? So, and there are a huge number of empirical facts to be explained, and we need a better, particularly at the foundation, we need a better understanding how we can ground these the minutiae of phenomenology of any one conscious experience, and how these can be related to the form of the physical substrate, whether that's in complex animals or in simple animals, or even ultimately in the limit in very simple ones, and possibly even in particles. But that's not a question right now that one can profitably empirically address. And so ultimately for me, it has to be making prediction that can be empirical tested. We want progress in our lifetime. And with that plea, I end my brief comments.